It would be like taking a gold bar and chucking it in the Mariana Trench in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's still there. Can't be confiscated.
That's half my portfolio. What do you say?
Hiding in relatively plain sight in the United Kingdom, perhaps not of the obvious richness to the same extent as Argentina. But
you're going to talk about the North Sea?
Well, I'm not just going to talk about the North Sea, although the North Sea is
That's the other half of my portfolio. Recently, head of research at Panmure Liberum, Times columnist and friend of the podcast Simon French, wrote an article in which he asked, can Kemi Badenoch sell Mileinomics in Britain? This was after the Conservative leader had said that she saw Argentina's Javier Milei as her template for government. An interesting thought experiment, but how serious is this idea? Is it realistic to expect the UK electorate to vote for such drastic economic reform? Do our politicians really understand what is involved in cutting back the state to the extent undertaken by the Milei administration over the last 18 months? Will the Argentine experiment deliver an oven-ready case study that the UK might consider adopting in 2029? To answer these and other questions about the economies and stock markets of both the UK and Argentina, and compare notes on these very different countries with fascinating interwoven histories, I invited Robert Marstrand, another friend of the podcast, to join Simon and I to discuss the central question: does Britain need a Javier Milei? Robert has lived in Buenos Aires for many years and writes the excellent Substack of Wealth. He believes that the UK must endure more economic and financial pain with the potential for currency and guilt crises before it is ready to accept the Milei medicine. Even then, he has his doubts. We discuss the disconnect between the economy and the stock market, and Simon offers his stockbroker's insight into how to pitch the UK's longer-term potential to global investors, who, after all, must stay invested and for whom other options are not looking great right now. They agree that the UK has been and might remain a good place to invest. We had a great discussion, but as always, none of what you are about to hear is investment or any other kind of advice, but for your information and hopefully enjoyment. Please take personal financial advice before investing a penny of your money in these crazy markets. With that said, please enjoy my conversation with Simon French and Robert Marstrand.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.
Guys, thanks for joining. Just really wanted to set the scene with you, Simon, to talk about where the UK economy is now and where it might be in the run-up to the next election, assuming it's in 2029.
At the risk of bringing portfolio language into the start of the podcast, it's something of a barbell economy right now, because you've got some quite interesting data points which international investors are very interested in. The UK economy, for example, in the first half of the year was the fastest growing G7 economy. The FTSE 100 has outperformed most developed indices in the first half of the year, and sterling is up 8% year on year. Actually, that side of the barbell, you could make quite a bullish argument of like the current state of the UK economy. Unfortunately, there's some deeply worrying data points. There's the near-term data points, which is that having layered on some quite significant tax increases in her first budget, the Chancellor Rachel Reeves is probably going to have to go again this autumn to keep within her self-imposed fiscal rules, which is likely to be a headwind to aggregate demand, a headwind to growth. We're also seeing quite considerable evidence that some of the policies that feel a little bit more ideological from the Labour Party on non-doms, on VAT on private school fees, on inheritance tax is starting to lead to quite a lot of flight of high net worth individuals out of the UK. And given how concentrated the tax base is towards those individuals, that comes with structural risk. But if you like, and maybe this is where this conversation will go over the next hour, is the bigger worry is the size of the UK state is now at a 75-year high, as is the tax burden. Public sector productivity is even worse than private sector productivity, which hasn't been particularly good for the last 15 years. So if you like those structural through-the-cycle data points, and this leads up to what kind of economy will exist in 2029, the likely timing of the next general election, there's some pretty big flashing red lights on the dashboard.
So, Robert, late last year, you gave us your sort of insider's view of what life was like on the ground in Argentina and the changes that you've seen in the last couple of years. How's it going? Milei seems to be maintaining his popular support.
Look, I think the direction of travel is excellent because this is a ex-rich country that went off track and managed to create very little from a great deal. I used to live in Hong Kong. That's a territory with no natural resources that created a very strong economy. Argentina's the opposite. It's got everything. It's a massive territory, relatively few people. It's about the population of Spain and the size of India. And yet it's created a relatively poor country with very high levels of poverty, purely through bad politics. Now, as for where we are now, perhaps you could compare it a little bit to the early Thatcher years when she came in 1979 and started all the very serious structural reforms to the economy. In my opinion, Milei is Thatcher on steroids. This is the most pro-capitalist government in the world, bar none. However, Rome isn't built in a day, and they're unwinding decades and decades of decline, poverty, over-regulation, ridiculous tax systems, and all the rest of it. They made and are making very fast progress. I mean, I think they've cut 15% of the staffing at the federal government level. We've moved from the chainsaw, which was the emergency measures to stop the money printing and close down whole departments and ministries and trim the fat. The way they describe it now is they've moved to the scalpel. So they're going through all the ministries in more detail to work out exactly what everybody does and does it need to be done by the government. And if they conclude not, they get rid of it. We've clearly had massive disinflation. So inflation peaked at 25.5% a month in December 2023. I think a couple of months after that, the annual backwards-looking rate went over 280% a year, which is horrendous. We're now down to about 1.5% to 2% a month, typically. That number is slightly false, I think, because within the numbers is a lot of withdrawal of old subsidies that kept prices of certain things absurdly low. So things like public transport, gas bills, water bills, electricity bills, that type of thing.
I remember you saying your utility bills had gone up several fold.
Oh, yeah. People will be shocked, but I think pre-Milei, my monthly electricity bill was equivalent to about $8 a month. And now I'm all the way up to, $30 a month or something, which is still extremely cheap. So I'd say it's good. He had delegated powers for a year from Congress to do certain emergency measures. That came to an end about a month ago, I think. The opposition is trying to throw spanners in the works at the moment. So we have midterm elections in October for half the seats in the Congress. And Milei's golden rule, the fiscal surplus is not negotiable. He says it again and again and again. So the opposition Peronists and other groups are trying to throw in lots of new spending. They legislate for that. So things like pension increases. But, they're promising lower taxes. Deregulation is happening. It's all good stuff, but it takes time. I remember Thatcher. In 1982, she was deeply unpopular. Unemployment was high, and it took time for the reforms to actually bear fruit.
I seem to remember there being several hundred, I think it was 200 and something odd economists writing an open letter saying that she was stark raving loony and had to U-turn immediately.
364 of them in 1981, the year of my birth.
Oh, okay, right. So you weren't a signatory to that.
I cannot be blamed for that. I can be blamed for lots of things, but not that one.
A piece that you, Simon, wrote in the Times a few weeks ago now about Kemi Badenoch and her speech to the effect that she wanted to duplicate the Milei model. What you said in your piece was that there really needs to be some evidence that the Argentinian experiment is working.
Yeah.
Is there sufficient evidence? And if not, what further proof do we need? What further evidence do we need?
You would have got pretty long odds 40 years ago of a leader of a conservative party saying that we're going to replicate Argentinian anything, yes, given the backdrop of the Falklands War and Maradona's Hand of God, which both got a mention in my Times column because you've got to get a bit of clickbait. I am a realist. in terms of the median voter in the UK, even if the economic post-mortem of Argentina come April 2029 is unalloyed success, whether that will cut through is questionable. It is very difficult to take, if you like, an unlived experience in a faraway country and explain a turnaround story using a particular economic doctrine and then apply it to what that means for pensions, for subsidization of various parts of the economy. But I think there is a scenario where, if you like, the commentariat could shift if there is a compelling case study in a country that has for so long been a sick man, not just of South America, but of the world. I think the international bodies, be it the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, are saying, and I hope Rob can correct me if I'm wrong, pretty positive stuff around the initial 18 months, 2 years of the what would be described as the Argentine experiment. But if there is the type of thing that is, if you like, through a whole political cycle can be held up as a case study, then we've seen the IMF, haven't we, pivot before from March exponents of austerity in the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis to something very, very different within about 4 or 5 years. If I go back to my experience in the UK civil service around the global financial crisis, it was very clear that the utterances of the IMF around the aftermath of the global financial crisis was an important intellectual ballast for George Osborne and David Cameron to introduce what was dubbed austerity, a retrenchment of the state. Now, you could argue how extensive that was, but it was absolutely key for them to not necessarily win a conversation on the doorstep, but to win the idea that their governing doctrine was something that was appropriate for the UK in the aftermath of the GFC.
How do you see what you've experienced in Argentina in terms of being relevant for the political debate over economic policy for the UK?
Well, clearly the situations are very different in the sense that Argentina was in crisis by the time Milei came on the scene and barreling into hyperinflation due to all the money printing and the various deficits. By the way, Argentina didn't get into this mess quickly. Juan Domingo Perón only came on the scene in the 1940s as president. Prior to that, he was a minister in a military dictatorship, but we'll gloss over that. And I would say that the rot didn't really set in until the 70s. The country didn't really start going off a cliff until the 70s. If I was to characterize where the UK is, I would say it's been making a lot of the same mistakes that got Argentina into this mess. So a bloated state, too much regulation, money printing to fund the deficits, which we clearly saw during COVID, etc. And I would say the UK is, if we take the start point for the real fiscal rot, which I would place at the moment when Tony Blair moved into number 10 in 1997. And the reason I say that is because I once worked out that adjusted for inflation, so in real terms, public spending per capita went up something like 40% during the Blair-Brown years, which is a staggering increase in the state. So they get the debt down and they create an illusion of growth, but they spent a lot of money. And then when the GFC came, the global financial crisis, the Tory austerity, in quotes, never really dialed that back at all. And now we've just seen the state getting bigger and bigger and taxes going up more and more. So if we start in 1997, I would say that the UK is something like Argentina in the 60s in terms of where it is, how close it is to the precipice. And it either changes direction, which I think has to involve scaling back the state as the first step, or it will enter into a series of sterling and or gilt crises, which will progressively get worse, in my opinion, unless there's a change of direction. And it's possible that even if there is a crisis within the next, say, 5 years, it's possible that that doesn't change the direction of travel because you could sink into more and more extreme populist politics of the type that Argentina has suffered, which actually make things worse. So, very short-termists resorting to money printing, populist handouts, etc. So the UK is approaching the precipice. Argentina is now trying to put itself back. But, in Argentina's case, they've stopped a crisis. Now the question is whether the growth kicks in. UK is very different. I don't know if people know, well, you won't know probably, but the British Embassy here in Buenos Aires has a staff bar for the staff and their guests, and it's called the Hand of God Bar. Just saying that. And in terms of the risk of Kemi Badenoch or anyone saying they admire Milei in the UK political context, I think it's quite interesting and brave that Milei has openly said on many occasions that he's a fan of Thatcher, which is quite controversial here as well, as you can imagine.
Of course, yes.
I'd be interested, where is Milei on social issues? Because I have a very clear view of where he is on economic issues. And I'll just give you the context of why I'm asking where he is on social issues, because if we're going back to Jeremy's original question of where the UK will be in 2029, well, based on the latest opinion poll I saw this morning, it will be governed by a reform-led government, if not a reform majority, given they're polling about 33, 34%, and all the rest in the high teens, including the current government. But the Reform Party are socially to the right, but they're economically pretty to the left, if truth be told. And then there's the descriptor of them as something of a horseshoe of their politics. Is Milei similarly horseshoe, or is he right socially and right economically?
Well, if you believe the Western media, he's far right in every respect, which is utter nonsense, frankly. I've yet to see jackbooted black shirts marching around Buenos Aires. I mean, it's just not the case. The issues he was elected on were primarily the economy, specifically high inflation, and getting that down. That was the single biggest issue. The other big issue was crime and corruption. They've been very clear that they've kept all the kind of social assistance and handouts going. So, for example, lower income women with children get a handout every month per child to help support themselves. You can't take that away because you'd have revolution. People need this money just to exist because of how broken the place is. Milei's government are very pragmatic about that. They need to create prosperity before they can take away the payments. We don't have the same kind of controversy around immigration, although they are clamping down on immigration from peripheral countries like Bolivia and Paraguay a little bit. But it's certainly nowhere near as controversial as it is in the UK. It's not a big deal. And frankly, the people that come here just want to come here to work. That's the only reason they come here. And believe it or not, there are countries in South America with even fewer job opportunities than Argentina. The other side, I suppose, he absolutely rejects all of what you might put into the bracket of wokery. He calls himself a liberal libertarian so that both Americans and Europeans understand it. Freedom is paramount, freedom of the individual, respect for others, and the principle of non-violence sort of underpin the philosophy. So he would say, and I've heard him say, why do we need a ministry for women and gender issues when everyone's equal anyway? So he got rid of it, closed it down. The only part he kept was a sort of phone service for women that was suffering domestic abuse, and he moved that into another ministry and kept it going, quite sensibly, obviously. Can I just ask or make an observation? In terms of the Tories channeling Milei or whatever, do they actually mean it? I mean, it's one thing to have a soundbite.
Yes. I think part of the problem is who is they, because they are now, although they only have 130 MPs, they are as split as probably the Labour Party were under Jeremy Corbyn, where you had some traditional Blairites and some of the hard left. The party itself is not united behind divisions, so certainly isn't united behind the idea of a Milei type, a Thatcherite type economic doctrine holding sway and having, the whole party whipped in behind it, albeit that is not unique to just the Conservatives. I mean, one of the big frustrations for me as a UK-focused economist is that we have a government who has a front bench who have an economic view and a bunch of backbenchers who do not share anything like that view, which is one of the reasons why any form of public spending cuts at the moment is off the table, because the Chancellor proposes it, the backbenchers refuse to vote for it, and we have a Prime Minister who won't whip their backbenchers into doing it. It's pretty dysfunctional for what is notionally a very significant majority government.
What you were saying seemed to reflect what Milei was saying to Voss shortly after he was elected, that he had a message. He basically had a message for the future of the West that they should listen to. We're not quite there yet. And from what you're saying, we might not be there for a number of decades yet.
To clarify, I think the West is deeply in the process already, probably 2 or 3 decades into the process. The question is when it actually goes off a cliff. And also, just as a broader point, it's put itself, given the very high debt and the repeated reliance on money printing, which are classic Argentine issues, it's put itself in a very weak strategic position. Every time there's a crisis, whether it's COVID or a war comes along or whatever it is, these countries are essentially, in my opinion, already bankrupt. So it's not a resilient place to be. And they keep racking up more and more debt. What's going to happen when the next recession hits in the UK or Europe or the US, let's say, and the fiscal deficits go from 5-6% of GDP to 8-9-10% of GDP for a year or two because the tax revenues plummet?
The window for what you can deliver in terms of economic policy requires what I've written up as a social license. What I'm getting from this conversation is that it took arguably 80 years worth of Peronism before there was a social license that brought Milei to power. And one of the reasons why I somewhat defend the West, defend is the wrong word, but perhaps less critical than a lot of people of Western governments and their proclivity for debt and money printing and enlarged state, is that they are only a reflection of their electorate. We get the leaders we deserve. There is no vote in the United States for a balanced budget. There is no vote in the United Kingdom for structural reform of the state and a balanced fiscal position. The example which is totemic in the United Kingdom, I think, was the 2017 election, when, to credit, the then Prime Minister Theresa May tried to address one of these long-standing fiscal issues on social care, introduced a policy in the manifesto which was very quickly dubbed by many as a dementia tax, and she almost lost the election to someone as unfit for government as Jeremy Corbyn. And that is the public going, we see your grown-up way of reforming a big, long-standing fiscal issue, and we reject it out of hand. I guess my question is, what journey did Argentina go on socially that got them in a position where they were prepared to vote for someone like Milei?
Well, I think they'd run out of options, essentially. I mean, this is a country that's lurched between... Peronism, by the way, is a very strange thing. It's not as simple as populist socialism. It started off as quasi-fascist. Peron was a big admirer of Mussolini. I would actually argue that fascism is a form of socialism. It's just more nationalist. But anyway, that's a long debate. But it's been lurching between sort of military dictatorships and occasional relief from more moderate parties like the Macri presidency, which was about 8-9 years ago. To slightly change the direction, I'd say I went to an investment conference back in January with a local brokerage outfit, and it was full of hedge funds from the US who were interested in the stock market and bonds and whatnot, and a few family offices. And the founder of this place came in at some point, grey-haired gentleman, very suavely dressed and all the rest of it. And he pointed out that in the 1960s, when he was a young man, the poverty rate here was about 6%. And last year, as they were still solving out the crisis, we got to about 55%. And these are not like the invented UK numbers, which are done on, I believe, relative to average incomes. These are absolute poverty. So it's, can you put a roof over your head and buy food and pay for your heating? So that shows what Argentines have witnessed during their lifetime. Did they think in the 1960s that they'd get to this point? I doubt it. There was a big middle class back then. I know lots of people here who still own, the properties that their parents and grandparents had back in those days, but they're all sort of crumbling a bit and their stuff gets sold off as people try to survive. So people won't have the appetite for radical change, I suspect, and this is why I'm a pessimist on the West in general. They won't have the appetite for radical change until it's too late, until crisis strikes. As I said earlier, you may not even get the change that's required.
Isn't the difference here that before Argentina reached the point of accepting the Milei experiment as its only option, it had run out of the ability to borrow and had gone for several cycles, I don't know how many, but for some considerable period of time, of having just to resort to printing its own money. Whereas the UK is nowhere near that. We're still a developed economy. We print our own money and we issue our own gilts. That's a cushion that can make this comparison pretty meaningless for some period of time.
What you're referring to is Argentina being locked out of the dollar foreign currency debt market since the crisis in 2001, 2002, when peso came off a dollar peg and crashed about 2/3 almost overnight. And then there were long sort of litigation processes and so forth, and restructurings and default and all the rest of it. In terms of peso debt, there's plenty of that about. They didn't stop doing local currency debt.
They just debased it.
Yeah, so the question is, does sterling turn into the British peso? Which I would say if they carry on this path long enough, it will do. But at the moment, obviously, it's not at that crisis point yet. One final point. You were saying how Argentina got locked out of those debt markets, so it had to print money to fund the deficits because it couldn't get its house in order. The UK's been doing loads of that already. QE during COVID was printing money to indirectly cover the huge deficits and the new issuance of gilts, in my opinion.
And arguably, we might have to resort to that again in the future.
And that caused, in my mind, Simon may disagree, but that caused in my mind and replicated in the US and other developed countries. That's the main reason there was an inflationary spike.
Yeah.
It wasn't the war in Ukraine. That may have affected certain individual commodities and may have been one or two issues with supply chains, but it's whack-a-mole.
You haven't been keeping up, Robert. The cause of the blip up in inflation most recently, and I'd be interested in Simon's view on this, is the reunion of Oasis and the impact on hotel prices.
I'm delighted to say I've got a couple of very hard-to-get tickets here in Buenos Aires at River Stadium in November.
You're the cause.
It's only 2 nights. Very hard to get tickets.
We should expect to see Argentinian inflation pick up again then in Q4.
Yeah.
Okay, understood. I mean, actually, the inflation data, there was warnings of an Oasis effect, but I don't think there really was in the data we got this week. I think my major takeaway actually is that the payroll tax increases that were introduced in April have been rather readily passed through to end consumer prices, particularly in the service sector. They've been part of the attractions, actually, of the UK, which are definitely not its public sector, either virility or its balance sheet. But the private sector balance sheet, the household balance sheet, is remarkably ungeared, which is both a blessing and a curse. It is a blessing in terms of the ability of the great British consumer to spend should they ever get their animal spirits back in decent quantities. But it's also a bit of a curse for inflation, because actually a lot of the services economy feel that they can quite comfortably pass through some of the on-costs of regulation, of payroll taxes, through to consumers, keeping inflation rather higher than, well, certainly the Bank of England's target, and actually compared to a lot of other developed economies. And that is developing into something of a doom loop, because that is creating higher nominal interest rates, and particularly the long end of the gilt curve, which is generating, because of what you correctly describe as, Rob, was some pretty big debt bills that were built up over the course of the COVID pandemic. That's actually quite painful servicing and refinancing challenges that come not just from debt, interest rates, inflation, but also a structural change, which, and you mentioned pensions about 15, 20 minutes ago. There's a big pensions change going on in the UK at the moment, which is the sunsetting pretty quickly of DB pension schemes, defined benefit pension schemes, that have for a long time been the natural bar at the long end of the UK curve. And actually, quite a stark collapse in that demand is a big contributing factor as to why no longer can the government fall back on issuing long-dated debt and relying on its pretty extensive DB pension scheme to mop up that issuance. And I guess to sort of complete the picture here is more short-dated debt, which is going to be the inevitable result, remove some of the financial resilience that was pre-pandemic and recoded into the UK's debt picture.
A weird consequence of Argentina being locked out of debt markets and having very high inflation and all the rest of it, and just being so unstable all the time, is that household credit here is tiny. A separate issue, but I think something like total private credit, I think, may still be only in single digits of GDP. Because the banks previously, all they did was they bought debt issued by the central bank, paying vast amounts of peso interest to cover their depositor interest costs. And the only lending they did really was credit cards, very short-dated debt at very high interest rates. And now the banks, which, by the way, they're mostly quite conservative, family-run organizations that had near-death experiences in 2002. So that's very still in their mindset. But now they're having to learn how to lend again to businesses and to people. There's a boom in auto finance. There's a big uptick in mortgages, which also, by the way, are virtually non-existent here. I mean, almost all property here is bought for cash, believe it or not. And people complain in the UK they can't afford property. Trust me, Most people here really can't afford property.
I read one of your Substacks, Rob, and one of the things you spoke about was the cycle of getting to where we've got to in Argentina involving financial repression. And one of the solutions, I think ill-informed solutions, is for governments faced by, if you like, a strike at the long end of their curve, which we're increasingly seeing not just in the UK, but around the world, either encouraging or forcing demand back into their domestic assets through what looks like financial repression. But now this is partly to sort of trigger Jeremy, but this is one of the reasons why I'm an advocate of stablecoins, is that one of the things the US, I think, has successfully done, and interestingly, overnight China have come to the party on stablecoins, is the idea that it could boost demand for their underlying short-dated debt instruments if those are eligible backing assets. There is a very, very interesting dance going on at the moment, I think.
This is a very interesting conversation, because the last time I discussed crypto with Robert, we were probably on our third bottle of red over lunch.
Well, I can't pretend.
But I don't remember him being a big bull, to be honest.
Well, and I'm not a big bull of private, non-asset-backed crypto assets. In fact, I'm one of the big skeptics. But I am of the utility factor for payments and for getting a stable demand picture for short-dated sovereign debt, which is going to be increasingly necessary if there is widespread skepticism on the sustainability of debt profiles in most Western countries at the moment.
I think Besant has said that he can see $2 or $2.5 trillion worth of demand coming from US-denominated stable coins. I mean, he's all in.
He is, and I mean, I'd be interested to see whether Milei goes down this route of, he's got a currency problem, hasn't he? He has a peso problem, he has a US dollar problem, which is one of the more difficult issues to navigate, is whether as non-fiat options emerge, whether there is another route. I mean, has he said anything publicly on crypto assets?
Argentina has had massive financial repression in every way you can possibly imagine. Interest rates below inflation, forced into the peso, can't buy dollars, capital controls, multiple exchange rates, extra taxes. So if an Argentine with a credit card goes overseas and spends money in a hotel, let's say, they whack a massive tax on top of what they spend, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Loads of it. In terms of crypto, putting stablecoins aside for a second, if they're officially sanctioned or whatever, if countries eventually get into a really sticky fiscal situation, they're going to start bringing in capital controls. And one of the obvious capital controls is to stop any competing currency being around. And we saw that in the past when, back in the 30s, the USA banned the ownership of gold. We saw it in China after the Communist Revolution in 1949, when they confiscated all the gold and Chinese weren't allowed to own it till 2004, I think, which, by the way, is part of the reason that we've had a bull market since, is that the Chinese can own gold now. And I think at some point, some of these governments will turn around and say, we're banning crypto. We're making it illegal to transact in crypto. And at that point, they can't seize it, but it becomes kind of worthless, because no business is going to accept or transact in crypto unless you have a big black market, because they're going to lose their licenses and their ability to operate. It would be like taking a gold bar and chucking it in the Mariana Trench in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's still there, can't be confiscated.
That's half my portfolio. What are you saying?
In 2008, when the global financial crisis kicked off, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner was the president, so the Kirchnerista Peronist. And there was a nascent but rather small private pension fund industry here, so defined contribution type pensions, whatever. And they basically just, to protect the people, they seized and confiscated all the funds and just rolled them into the public pension system. This is the kind of stuff governments do.
Coming back to Milei, he's done simple but effective things first off in terms of fiscal consolidation and controlling inflation. It seems much more nuanced and delicate in terms of what he's got to do now, in terms of bringing Argentina into the global capital market. Can he land that plane?
I think their hope is to grow their way out of the debt, principally, rather than paying it down. The finance minister is a guy called Luis Caputo. I believe he's an ex-JP Morgan trader or something. Very capable guy. I saw a speech he gave a month or two ago. They're talking about, if they can achieve, say, 5 or 6% real GDP growth in the coming years and keep the spending essentially flat in real terms, or keep cutting it even further from where it is, then we're going to start getting massive tax cuts. We're talking about handing back 1 or 2% of GDP a year, perhaps, in tax cuts, which is massive. We're talking about 10% of the federal spending per year. Going back to your point, he's done a bit more. He has already cut quite a few taxes. Argentina has idiotic export tariffs on its agricultural and mining production. They've cut a lot of those. They've eliminated some, the big ones on soybeans and things they're trying to bring down. They made a permanent cut recently, and that will keep coming down. They're definitely cutting import tariffs dramatically. Argentina used to have the most expensive iPhones and iPads in the world just because of import tariffs. Crazy for a low-income country. So those things are getting much cheaper. Cars, motorbikes, parts for industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all good. And deregulation. Deregulation is a bit boring, so I'll give you one simple example. There's a minister for deregulation and state transformation. They created a new ministry, believe it or not, for that. And a guy called Federico Sturzenegger. The guy set up an email and then a website where anyone in Argentina can contact him and his team and say, this thing is screwing up my business, do something about it. I'll give you one simple example he gave us. He said a guy wrote to him who exports watermelons. And the government had a regulation in some ministry that you had to pack your watermelons a certain way. You had no choice. And he said, but I can't do this because my customers outside the country want them packed a different way. This is crazy, but I'm forced to pack them this way that the government dictates. So what I have to do is I have to ship my watermelons offshore in the way the government tells me. And then when they're at sea, I have to repack them the way that my customers want to receive them. And so they got rid of it. But it's just like loads, dozens, hundreds and hundreds of those things that they're stripping out the system.
One of the ironies here is that Milei has spent his time cutting tariffs and doing Doge. Trump and the world we live in has done nothing but erect tariffs.
I think the US plays by one set of rules, and every other country in the world, maybe with the honourable exception of China, plays by a different set of rules. And one of the, I think, sobering experiences that the UK had in 2022 in the aftermath of the mini-budget, or during the mini-budget in the aftermath, is that a whole new generation of UK politicians learned that they are not running the US economy. And that lesson needs to be learned every generation and relearned. And therefore, I think there's a risk that what is a friction to trade, a friction to economic efficiency, drives up prices with almost no countervailing upside, if you think of those as downsides, is not a doctrine that any other country, apart from the United States, can follow. Now, the United States can potentially, and potentially China, can dictate terms, can withdraw concessions out of its trading partners, effectively by being the bully in the international trading playground. That leverage does not exist for Argentina, does not exist for the United Kingdom, does not exist for most mid-sized middle-income countries. They can and should play for as long as they, in an open-ended way down that route, because it is the path to prosperity, it is the path to efficiency of your private sector, not to try and ape what President Trump is doing.
My guess is Milei would like to get to a position where there are zero tariffs, both on exports and imports.
He wants to be the freest market economy in the world, doesn't he?
It doesn't actually matter what anyone else is doing. That's where he'll want to get to. The only constraint on that is that they rely on the tax revenue because of the way the system was set up in the past, particularly the export taxes on agricultural production. The issue for Argentina actually isn't so much that, it's the local issues that damage exporters. So we have ridiculous employment laws. It's very hard to lay anyone off without having to pay massive compensation to them. Literally, you make someone redundant and you'll have to pay a year of salary for every year they've worked for you in some cases. I know people have gone bankrupt over this, and all the local regulations, but they're working hard on the regulations and also the taxes. The taxes on business are horrendous. So if you're a local producer trying to export, you have that headwind against you. So they need to solve the local issues here more, but they'll also get rid of the tariffs.
Jeremy, am I allowed to be upbeat at this point?
Change of course.
Again, at the risk of presenting myself like I did some homework, again, reading some of Rob's stuff, and also my preparation for my own column in the newspaper on Argentina, I was struck by quite how richly blessed Argentina is in terms of natural resources. And hiding in relatively plain sight in the United Kingdom, perhaps not of the obvious richness to the same extent as Argentina. But
you're going to talk about the North Sea.
Well, I'm not just going to talk about the North Sea, although the North Sea is
That's the other half of my portfolio.
Well, no, I mean, it is symbolic of a broader thing of it is a temperate climate. It has relatively rich agricultural land. It not only has hydrocarbons within the North Sea, but it has probably the basin that is most suitable to exploiting renewable energy as well. It has great lineage in nuclear capability. The UK, actually, if you step back and go, what it is blessed with, both naturally and in terms of its lineage, if you strip back a lot of the things that are throttling development and deployment of capital, actually, unlike, and I'm not going to name names, but you could think of countries around the world that are not blessed with a quarter of that in terms of their natural advantages, there's the opportunity set. And actually, despite coming to the city in 2014 and almost every year since has been difficult to broke UK assets because of various geopolitical issues, from Scottish referendum through Brexit, through the fallout from that, the pandemic, now asymmetric inflation. There is still amongst international investors a belief that sitting beneath this throttled economy are some really interesting opportunities that are keenly valued and there to be exploited by actually a government, if it's got the vision, to strip back some of the barriers to growth that have been self-imposed. They aren't natural barriers, they are self-imposed.
Well, we all know that the economy is not the market and the market's not the economy. We last spoke in November 2023, Simon. It was a podcast entitled The Case for Investing in the UK Equity Market. You made a very strong case. And since then, I checked it this morning, FTSE is up 30%. Now, S&P 500 is up 35%, but still not bad. One of the memorable things I think you said in that podcast was you felt the UK was still on the Brexit naughty step. How are you pitching it to overseas investors where the UK is sort of keeping up with everybody else all of a sudden, or certainly keeping up with the US, and in some measures, as you mentioned, more recently outperforming, and sterling's up?
I was in favour of Remain, but I was not an evangelical Remainiac, never have been, never will be. I probably sit in the, maybe if you were to align me with a sort of more famous, celebrated economist, Mervyn King, former governor of the Bank of England, who probably is a bit more Brexity than I am, but he acknowledged, I think, when Mervyn's talked about this.
He must have voted leave, surely.
I'm assuming so.
Yeah.
But I don't think he's ever publicly declared it. But I think he would acknowledge that, and which is where I sit, which is once you get out the other side of the transition to a different regulatory relationship with your biggest trading partner, actually, though, once those costs have been introduced into the baseline, actually the long-term impact on trend growth is relatively minimal. Most of that transitional friction, political and economic order, have largely been done. And therefore, for international investors that went, look, post-2016, we're just going to go underweight the UK. You could see it in successive Bank of America, Merrill Lynch fund manager surveys. They were just underweight UK equities. Actually, because that drove publicly quoted assets to a considerable discount, even if you account for the compositional effect of the UK market, having gone through that friction, which weighed down sterling, actually now you can see sterling is that great bellwether. It's starting to tell you that there is more interest on pure valuation grounds. Not because it's a huge vote of confidence in the UK economy. The UK economy, which of course isn't the stock market, has big structural challenges. But there are some really good companies listed in the UK that have had a scarring effect because of Brexit and the currency, which is starting to unwind. And you can see the flows and the sentiment starting to respond to that, and indeed performance.
Yeah, any company that has weathered that last decade has almost by definition, if it's, say, in the FTSE 250, going to be a pretty bloody resilient company, and battered down from a value perspective because of the, as you say, having an allocation to the UK for a global investor has become or had become almost an irrelevance.
And my frustration, my deep-seated frustration, is that the government coming in, the UK government in July 2024, could have run with a couple of pieces of momentum that built up. An acknowledgement amongst the international investor community that that hangover of Brexit was starting to ease. The Alka-Seltzer had been taken and we were sort of on the recovery path. But actually, you've got to be invested. And if you've got choices of where you can deploy your capital, other countries in the world have very, very considerable challenges. We focus this podcast on the contrasts and the parallels and the lessons that can be learned between the UK and Argentina, but Japan, France, Italy, the United States we've touched on. Other areas where you could park your capital have got big structural challenges of an aging demographic, a sclerotic state, poor productivity. The UK could have positioned itself, and I think the front page of The Economist tried to do this in around July 2024, which was probably the biggest sell signal going, as the UK as that beacon of relative, not absolute, but relative safety for your capital. I still think that was a huge missed opportunity, that political naivety from both the Chancellor and the Prime Minister in the summer of 2024 has made the job of growing the UK economy that much harder.
How would you compare that, Robert, with the outlook from an investor's perspective? Argentinian equities have had a very good run since Milei has come to power. How do you see the outlook for Argentina from an investment perspective?
Just first of all, can I just say, despite all my negativity about the UK, I've actually personally been quite heavily invested there for the last few years and have done very, very well, because there are some great companies that were trading at amazing prices, as far as I'm concerned, with great dividend yields and all the rest of it. So been a good place to be. I'm actually trying to scale back, but that's more of a diversification issue at the moment. But that's a separate matter. As for Argentina, predicting what's going to happen in Argentine stock markets, like guessing which way your cat's going to walk. It has only something like 24 US listed ADRs and RG stocks. That's basically the extent of the market. And one of those is Mercado Libre, which is the biggest by market cap company in Latin America and mainly does business in Brazil and Mexico, and then Argentina third. The rest of it is a smattering of energy companies, utilities. There's a cement company, a port company, there's a couple of property companies, and then the domestic banks. And I would say the banks were hugely overpriced at the end of last year and are now have come down 30, 40% in some cases. And I'd say they're kind of kicking around fair value-ish, probably still overpriced, given that inflation's still running over 20% a year. If we can get through the October midterms, if inflation keeps coming down, and if their prices don't rocket just on political news, which is a very volatile market day to day here, they might be interesting later in the year, the domestic banks, because they're exposed to the domestic economic growth and specifically the boom in credit. And they're very unleveraged. But there's not a lot to invest in here. But if Milei can keep it on track, I think it will be a good prospect for those sorts of businesses. And real estate.
Direct real estate.
Well, no, that's very complex. That's
you need a lot of $100 bills and good security, don't you?
Yeah, you'd have to be really committed, or maybe committed to a loony bin to get involved in that. But it would be very hard for a foreigner just to buy, a house or a flat here. But, there's one property company called ESO, which I think is pretty interesting. Combination of shopping malls, which I wouldn't recommend over in the UK, but here we're way behind on the sort of e-commerce curve. And this is really prime stuff in prime locations. Shopping malls, offices, and a huge residential development in the fanciest bit of Buenos Aires, which they think by the time they get to the last phase in 10 years' time, it'll be the most expensive property in Argentina that they're selling per square meter.
Sounds interesting. Thank you. Guys, I've taken up a lot of your time. Thank you both for joining. Any last questions, comments?
I'm rather downbeat about the longer term prospects for the UK, and I hope the political situation can change and avert crisis before it happens. But right now, I think it's more likely that it will have to suffer crisis before change happens. And it's on the path of Argentina in the past, sadly.
I have to say the takeaway message from me is that any real meaningful learnings from the Argentinian experience, unfortunately, probably requires much more pain.
Just to add my tuppence to that, I think the route out of the current malaise the UK finds itself in has three options. We talked about Argentina. I think Greece is another option. Japan is another option. And none of them are painless. In fact, they're all painful. If you think of Greece as requiring international, in their case, the Troika, oversight to make very, very difficult decisions on debt restructuring in return for public spending decisions on pensions and on welfare and on the cost of running the public sector and the scale of the public sector, then that is another option. And then Japan, not the Japan of the last 30 years, but actually the Japan of post the Second World War, where you have wholesale financial repression in order to, in effect, kick the can down the road and hope that some of that financial repression yields some productive investment that can raise your trend growth. None of them are pleasant options or indeed good options for international investors. It is when the politics and the economics align to pick one of those other options, because at the moment the politics and the economics are aligning to muddle through.
It's a deferral of pain, isn't it? Okay, thank you so much.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.